Madam President, last week some of my colleagues in this chamber were sanctioned by Vladimir Putin for standing up for the Ukrainian people, standing up for freedom, standing up for their democratic aspirations, standing up for the sovereignty of the Ukraine. And as I said in Brussels at the German Marshall Fund this weekend, if I have been sanctioned for those reasons, then I say by all means, Mr. Putin, sanction me. And I would urge all of my colleagues to be supportive of the legislation. They may be sanctioned at the end of the day, but that's really what standing up for the Ukraine is all about at this critical moment and what it means beyond. Madam President, when we look around the world, we realize that every so often we face a critical juncture at a time of great upheaval and change. With the backsliding of Russian leadership to a pre-1991 posture, we are at such a juncture. Vladimir Putin seems to view the pre-1991 Soviet Union's expansionist authoritarianism as the present-day goal. And the last 2 decades, which saw the formation of new and independent states, as a departure from Peter the Great's expansionist aspirations. From Ukraine to Georgia to the Middle East, we are seeing a new Russian leadership bent on using its military authority, its economic resources, and diplomacy to serve its parochial interests at any cost, despite violations of its own legal commitments and those it has made to the international community. Russia's flat-out extortion of Ukraine, supported by former corrupt leaders of Ukraine, forced the political explosion which Russia then exploited. In Syria, President Putin is actively propping up President Bashar al-Assad and perpetuating the world's worst humanitarian disaster. In Iran, the ink of the Joint Plan of Action signed in Geneva last November was barely dry when reports surfaced that Tehran and Moscow were negotiating an oil-for-goods swap worth $1.5 billion a month, and that they plan to build a new nuclear plant, all steps that only aid Iran in pursuit of nuclear weapons while diminishing the sanctions that forced that country to the negotiating table in the first place. It's no surprise that Putin and his cronies have already threatened to derail Syria and Iran talks if their countries don't step back from punishing Russia for its annexation of the Ukraine. In Geneva, as the P5+1 talks with Iran continue, we can only hope that the crisis in Ukraine will not have a ripple effect in Russia's position or participation. But in my view, Mr. Putin has miscalculated. He has reignited a dangerous pre-1991 Soviet-style game of Russian roulette with the international community, and we cannot blink. We must understand that he must understand, I should say, that we will never accept his violation of international law in the Ukraine. That's why we passed this legislation in committee. An aid package for Ukraine that provides loans for economic stabilization, supports planning for upcoming democratic elections, aids in the recovery of stolen assets, and expands security cooperation between the two countries. And it holds Moscow accountable for its aggressive stance against Ukraine. First, this legislation provides for Ukrainian loan guarantees consistent with the $1 billion announced by the administration in recent days. It mirrors the House legislation. Second, it ensures that the Obama administration can assist the Ukrainian government to identify, secure, and recover assets linked to the acts of corruption by Viktor Yanukovych, members of his families, or other former or current Ukrainian government officials. Third, it authorizes $50 million for democracy, governance, and civil society assistance, and $100 million for enhanced security cooperation for the Ukraine and other states in Central and Eastern Europe. Fourth, it mandates sanctions, complementing the President's recent executive order against Ukrainians and Russians alike responsible for violence and serious human rights abuses against anti-government protesters, and those responsible for undermining the peace, security, stability, sovereignty, or territorial integrity of the Ukraine, as well as imposing sanctions on Russian individuals complicit in or responsible for significant corruption in the Ukraine. And fifth, It allows the administration to broadly sanction corrupt Russian officials and go after Putin's allies and cronies who are engaged in massive corruption to the detriment of the Russian people. And finally, it provides needed reforms to the United States' participation in the International Monetary Fund, which would allow the United States to leverage significant support from the IMF for Ukraine today and for similar unforeseen crises that are going to come in the future. It is the IMF that is leading the effort to stabilize Ukraine's fragile economy, an essential task if there is to be any chance of reaching a peaceful political solution to the standoff with Russia. Congressional ratification of the 2010 IMF reforms would increase IMF emergency funding to the Ukraine by up to 60%. And it would provide an additional $6 billion for longer-term support, setting an important marker for other donors such as the EU and the World Bank. Failure to approve the reforms, on the other hand, would undermine both the IMF and the international standing of the United States. Some countries are happy to see U.S. global influence diminish. Failing to approve the reforms weakens the United States and emboldens our competitors. The IMF is strengthened at no cost to U.S. finances or influence. The United States retains its executive board seat and sole veto power at no net cost, since the $63 billion increase in U.S. quota is fully offset by an equivalent decrease to a separate emergency facility. Other countries, however, put in new money, increasing IMF lending power. The fact is, it is a pure win for the United States. We will pay for the $315 million budget impact of the bill with real cuts and from funds that were underperforming or no longer needed. Given that the IMF helps to stabilize countries, often precluding future need for military action, the relatively minor costs will pay back many times over. And this is not a partisan issue. Presidents Reagan, Clinton, and both Presidents Bush backed legislation to increase IMF resources, and President Reagan called the IMF, quote, the linchpin of the international financial system. These efforts combined send a message to the world that the annexation of Crimea will not stand. Let me close by saying we are at a dangerous moment in history with global consequences, and the world is watching. If the West does not act, what will China say when it's looking at its territorial desires in the South China Sea? What will Iran say when we are negotiating in Vienna about nuclear weapons? What will others in the world say? North Korea, whose march to nuclear weapons on a greater scale is still in play. All of them will be looking at what we in the West do or do not do in making a decision about Russia's brazen move into the Ukraine. They will be watching to see how far they can go, how much they can do. They will be asking, what can I get away with? The fact is, as a matter of principle, Ukrainian sovereignty cannot be violated for simply looking westward and embracing ideals rooted in freedom. These ideals must always remain first and foremost in our strategic response to international events. When I was in Brussels last week at NATO and the German Marshall Fund, I said, the broader question that faces us is this: can a united transatlantic vision and our collective commitment to bold actions in this century match the vision and the commitment of those who created the international institutions which brought peace and prosperity to millions in the last century? I believe that if we live, lead, and govern, guided by shared values and united by our common concerns, we can lead the world through this transformational moment in history and prevent further Russian aggression from taking us back prior to what was that 1991 world.